Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Packers getting set to take on the Saints Monday Night Football at Lambeau Field. I said this about a game earlier in the season. By the way, this video is final thoughts, Packers-Saints, diving into the matchup a little bit on both ends of the coin, taking a deeper look at New Orleans, what they do well, what they don't do well, injuries, which have been a plenty for New Orleans entering this game on Monday night. I said this about a game earlier in the season. I don't remember which one it was. This is it applies again for the Packers, and it's not meant to be a disrespect towards the Saints. It's just the reality of things at the current position for both squads. This is a don't play with your food game for the Green Bay Packers. You're at home. You're a substantial favorite in this one. Of course, the lines are never the be-all, end-all, but the odds makers, everyone thinks Green Bay should win this one going away. It's hard to do that in the National Football League. You typically don't see lines where a team is favored by nearly 2 touchdowns. That is the case in this one. Last time I looked, Green Bay was favored by 13. This is a don't play with your food game for the Green Bay Packers. No Derek Carr. Unlikely, it sounds like, to have star running back Alvin Kamara. The practice window for star wide receiver Chris Olave to return from a concussion earlier in the season has opened for New Orleans, so he's back at practice in a limited capacity, but are they going to bring him back the first week once the window's open? I don't know. I don't even know if we'll see Olave the rest of the season, if it's worth it for them to put him back out there after he has sustained multiple concussions just in his first couple of seasons in the National Football League. So you're talking about a Saints team that's already out of the playoff picture, can't finish 500. They're sitting at 5-9 entering this game on Monday night, and they won't have their starting quarterback, unlikely to have their star running back, and at least a very, very foggy sort of spot with their number one wide receiver as far as his playing status. Again, as Olave has returned to practice in a limited capacity, and the window for New Orleans to bring him back has opened. And so there's a lot, like, it's a mess for New Orleans, quite frankly. They fired their head coach, Dennis Allen, back in November, around the midpoint of the season after a 7-game losing streak. Things just aren't going well for the Saints, and when you pile on injuries to key starting positions, and in this case, we're looking at quarterback, running back, and your wide receiver one, it makes things increasingly more difficult for anyone, let alone the Saints, who are going up against a Packers team that are playing a really, really strong brand of football lately. I don't know if you guys have paid attention to the Saints. You know, they're not in the division, they're not in the playoff hunt, so if you haven't, if you're a Packer fan, I get that. You might be surprised to know the number one target right now in the passing game for New Orleans is, and it's an old friend alert, it's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. MVS has been kind of the anointed number one wide receiver with the Olave injury and not much else to work with for this quarterback room in New Orleans. MVS, however, was a DNP on both Thursday and Friday's practice reports in the lead up to this game against Green Bay. But in his last 2 games, MVS has 7 targets in each game, and he has 4 touchdowns in the last 5 outings for New Orleans. So if he's available and he's out there, I think it said chest/illness for MVS's reasoning as to why he had a DNP in back-to-back days this week. But if he's out there, I mean, we know he's a vertical threat. We saw it in Green Bay in his many years with the Packers, or I should say his few years with the Packers. But he's sort of the guy right now, and I love MVS. But if he's your number one wide receiver, it's probably not an ideal situation. He's more of a, I would say, like number 3 on a depth chart on a really good team. Maybe a number 2, but still I think a number 3. And right now for New Orleans, he's having to wear the crown of number 1 wide receiver against 7 targets back-to-back games, 4 touchdowns in 5 games he's producing because of injuries and just kind of the mess, I would say, that New Orleans has found themselves in. It's just, there's a million ways you could try to carve it up. I think if you simplify it, and I think if you ask New Orleans fans, they would agree, it's just not a good Saints team. It's a Saints team that, like I said, fired their coach in November, and they still have no real direction, right? Like there's no real calling card for this Saints team as they continue to kind of spiral. Now, I will note it's a Saints team that has not mailed it in. Derek Carr was out last week. They started Jake Haener, former Fresno State product. He struggled. They came out in the second half and went to Spencer Rattler, who started 3 games earlier in the season, rookie out of South Carolina. And they made a valiant effort and a great comeback, albeit partially induced by a clock error late in the game. But they were a 2-point conversion away from beating Washington, who's a wild card team at the moment in the NFC. And New Orleans came up a 2-point conversion attempt short of really stunning the Commanders, because Washington controlled that game for like 2.5, nearly 3 quarters before the Saints made a late push in that one. So it's not a team that, and I don't know if, far be it from me to say it, because I went back and watched their game against Washington. I have not watched many of their other games this year. Like, I remember watching their Week 2 win against Dallas, and that's all the way back in September. But it's a Saints team that, at least in last week's game when I went back and watched against Washington, it doesn't appear to be a team that is like given up. They're not throwing in the towel, even though, now they're 5-9, and they didn't throw in the towel last week, even though they were without their starting quarterback in Derek Carr. And I think one thing I'd be curious to know from Saints fans is, like, with losing teams and teams who are out of the picture in December as the calendar gets set to turn to January, you like to have a couple of spots to point out with sort of like a look towards an optimistic future. Like, the Saints are 5-9, and so if you're a Saints fan, where are those players, where are those spots that you're pointing at and you're saying, hey, that gets me kind of excited about the future of this team down the road? And I'm sure those exist. I just I don't know where they're at on the roster, because for me, I always start with quarterback play. I like Derek Carr, savvy veteran. Derek Carr can win you some games. Is he ever really going to win you a Super Bowl? Even if you have, and he's never had this really in his career, but if you have an immense amount of offensive talent around Derek Carr, is he a good enough quarterback to win you a Super Bowl? I say probably not, right, at this point. Like, the sample size is large enough, even though he's never really been in a situation like that. I would say this year and last year, you have Kamara, who's a really, really good running back. Olave, when he's on the field, has proven to be, in his short career in the NFL, a pretty damn good wide receiver. So I think it starts at quarterback for them. And while I like Kamara, he's not getting any younger. Olave is a bright spot, but he's had trouble staying on the field, not, through his own fault. So I'd be curious to see, like, where Saints fans are looking at for optimism towards the future, now that this season obviously appears to be a lost one in terms of, postseason dreams, aspirations, so on and so forth. And so I think it's a really, really tough spot to be in for New Orleans. I don't know what their cap situation looks like. Going into next offseason, they should have a decently high draft pick, but are you going to have one high enough to take one of the top quarterbacks, whether that's Jaire Sanders or Cam Ward or whoever else is being floated out there? I know Beck from Georgia, his status has fallen down mightily. Jalen Milroe from Bama, like, is he going to be a top 10, 15 pick? I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see how the Saints navigate the offseason. I really liked Kool-Aid McKinstry, the cornerback out of Alabama, that they ended up snagging in the draft. So maybe that's a spot you look at. But as far as optimism, but it can't be great right now, I would say, to be a Saints fan, because you are trying to find those optimistic spots for the future. And I don't know where they exist, because I haven't watched this team nearly enough. I will say, as it pertains to this matchup against Green Bay, and it's a big if New Orleans wants to pull this one out, and it would be a surprise, certainly a surprise if they won in Lambeau Field on Monday night. They have to slow it down, and they have to make this a low-scoring affair against the Packers. With how the Packers are playing and what New Orleans doesn't have in its toolbox, you're not winning a shootout against this Packers team. You're just not. It's not realistic. If Green Bay, and I don't know if Green Bay would even want to make it a track meet, but if it somehow develops into that, it heavily, heavily favors Green Bay. New Orleans doesn't have the pieces. They don't have it in their arsenal to hang with Green Bay or any of these high-scoring teams in a shootout. And so I think for New Orleans, one of their keys is, and when I say slow it down, make it a low-scoring affair, or try to do that, I think sometimes people might think I'm saying be conservative, like be hesitant. No, I'm just saying be smart. Like, don't try to turn this into a first one to 30 type battle because, I mean, I'm going to throw some numbers your way like I always do, but I'm not going to suffocate you guys and gals with them, but I'm going to throw them out there. This is a New Orleans team that if it turns into that in a high-scoring affair, they're not going to be able to keep up with Green Bay. The Saints have not scored more than 19 points in a game in over a month. That's with Derek Carr and without Derek Carr. Again, the Saints have not scored more than 19 points in a game in over a month. The last time they did so was November 17th. Meanwhile, the Packers have scored 30-plus in 4 straight, and they face some pretty good teams. Most notably, even the last 2 weeks, you're talking about going up against Seattle on the road, and the week before that, Detroit on the road. And I know the Lions game was a loss, 34-31, but you're still putting up 30-plus. And so it's a Saints offense that hasn't scored more than 19 in over a month, going up against a Packers team that has scored 30-plus in 4 straight games, or about a month. Spencer Rattler will be starting this game for New Orleans. All indications point to that. I mentioned he's a rookie out of South Carolina. He's 0-3 in 3 starts. Did not get the nod with Derek Carr out last week. They instead went to Jake Haener, who struggled against Washington. This is a hard spot for any backup, or like last week, he was the backup, so technically you could say Rattler was the third stringer if you want, when Carr was healthy. This is a tough spot for any non-starting quarterback to be in, let alone a rookie who, as he's navigating the scene and he's at practice this week, is looking and saying, oh, I'm probably not going to have my star running back to lean on. And who knows about our wide receiver 1, who hasn't played in quite a while and is trying to return from a brutal concussion. And so Rattler's probably looking around. In MVS, who has been their number 1 target in the passing game, a DNP on Thursday and Friday. I don't know what his status looks like for Monday outside of that. And so it'd be a tough spot for any, non-starting quarterback to be in. Hell, it'd be a tough spot for a starting quarterback to be in some situations, let alone Rattler, a rookie. I mean, everything in this game stacks up in Green Bay's favor. And maybe I shouldn't say everything because you can nitpick, but just about any number, stat, metric, motivating factor, all that stuff, it leans towards the Packers in this game on Monday night. And I guess if there's one thing New Orleans can hang its hat on, at least recently, you can look to the defensive side of the ball, although it's hard to tell, and I'll explain. New Orleans defense, even though there isn't really a lot of name recognition, especially after the Marshawn Lattimore trade, they still have Cameron Jordan. He's had a quiet season. The defense has looked feisty lately for the Saints, which is a compliment. They've looked like they still have a little bit of an edge to them, which is good. And you can look at the Saints defense and say, oh, in their last 5 games, New Orleans has allowed less than 23 points in 5 straight. That's pretty damn impressive, especially for a team that is not going to be a playoff team that's sitting at 5-9. Like, most teams in the NFL, if you say they've held their opponent to 23 or less in 5 straight games, I would lean towards that. Like, if I didn't know any other factor, I'd say it's probably a pretty decent football team. Instead, the Saints aren't, but the defense has done that. The problem is you can't just look at a base stat like that and say, oh, New Orleans in 5 straight games has held its opponents to 23 or less, and then come to the conclusion like, wow, the Saints defense must be playing really, really good. You have to look into it a little bit more. And so I looked at who they played, who was in the lineup for those teams, who was out of those lineup for those teams that they played against. And while it's impressive that New Orleans has held its opponents to 23 or less in 5 straight games, I will point out, in terms of scoring offenses, those 5 opponents have been the number 6, which is Washington, but also the number 18, 21, 30th, and 32nd out of 32 scoring offenses. One of those, obviously, the Giants are the lowest scoring team in the NFL. And so it's hard for me to... I'll give the Saints credit because it's not their fault who's on the schedule, but I will take that number of them holding 5 straight to 23 or less with a grain of salt because in those 5 games, they haven't seen an offense like the Packers, who have demoralized some defenses by just running it down their throats. repeatedly with Josh Jacobs, and then opening up the play-action passing game with Jordan Love, who has a bevy of options with Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Tucker Kraft, Luke Musgrave, hopefully back soon, and in the mix for Green Bay as well. Bo Melton, if you want to throw him in the name, the array of names as well. And so I tip my cap to New Orleans and their defense for what they've done in the last month and a little bit of change. But this is a different beast in Green Bay. It just is, with the offense that they're going up against on Monday night. It is Mitch. I am on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. I said this on a video last week, I believe. If I'm Green Bay, I know some people will take issue with this, and I'm fine with it because I get the other side of the coin. If I'm Green Bay, I'm sitting Jaire. I think they said Quay Walker was in a walking boot early this week, so I'm not expecting him to play. Matt LaFleur said Quay Walker is more as week to week than day to day. I doubt Bullard plays. Ballantyne was on the practice. The injury report, I think he was limited, I want to say. And Luke Musgrave limited as well. Now, Jaire has logged full participation statuses at practice. Keep in mind, in the lead-up most recently, he was limited and then full and then didn't play. And obviously that's a coach's decision, trying to hold out for Jaire to come back late in the season. And he's been a full participant this week for the Packers before this game on Monday night. But if I'm the Packers, I'm holding Jaire out in this one. Quay's probably not going to play. Bullard's not going to play. I'm holding Musgrave out as well. Because I'll say this again, and I mentioned it last week in one of the videos, I don't know which one. If you can't beat this Saints team without those pieces, as good as they are, I don't think you're a team that's going to make a postseason run anyways. And so you can say you're playing with fire a little bit by being conservative with some of these injuries, but the Packers historically have done that. If someone's really close, we'll give them a shot. We'll give them a shot throughout the week is what Matt LaFleur has used as sort of a recycled line, but it's a valid one. The Packers typically lean towards not playing guys who are really right on the fence. And with Jaire logging full participation on the practice reports this week, it lends credence to the idea that maybe he is ready to return on Monday night. I'd still hold him out. I just, for this game, I would. And give him another week and then get him ready for Minnesota. Because while the Packers aren't in the playoffs, a win on Monday night secures a playoff berth. And the Saints are just in such a bad spot, injury-wise, really motivation-wise. At this point, you're 5-9. How much did they, empty the tank against Washington at home as one last sort of hurrah? And they had to really empty the clip to make a comeback in that game, which they did. Again, it came down to a 2-point conversion. But if you can't beat this Saints team without Jaire and Quay, and again, I expect Bullard to be out, I don't, with everything that's on the line for the Packers too, I don't know how this would be a team that could be taken seriously to make a playoff run. You should be able to beat the Saints, and there should be no reservations about that without 23 and without 7. And I'll throw 88 Musgrave in there as well, and I mentioned the rookie safety, Bullard. And so the other side of that is, hey, if guys are ready to play, frickin' play them. I get that. With the injury history for Jaire in recent seasons, especially piling up, you need him in the postseason. You absolutely need him. I thought it was a valiant effort by the cornerbacks last week in Seattle. I thought they balled out. Keyshawn, CV had the pick. Didn't hear Eric Stokes' name much, which if you're not hearing his name on the broadcast is probably a good thing, right? And so I thought the DBs, primarily the corners, really stepped up to the plate against a stout Seattle wide receiver group. Now the pass rush helped the DBs because they were making life miserable for Geno Smith and Sam Howell all week. But with Jaire, I'm looking at the down the road type ordeal for the Packers and how if you want to not only hang with but beat Philly, not only hang with but beat Detroit, not only hang with but beat Minnesota if somehow that happens as a playoff matchup, they need 2-3 out there. They really do, because without him, it's a really thin cornerback room. So I'd hold Jaire out, even though he's a full participant. I get the other side of it. I 100% get the other side of that. And New Orleans is battered with injuries at key spots. Going to finish under 500. And yes, they're playing spoiler. That's New Orleans' motivation right now, is you're playing spoiler, and if you're a young guy, you're trying to prove your worth. Like Rattler. You want to prove, hey, I can be a backup at worst in this league. I have starting capabilities. So he's going to come out with his hair on fire trying to prove a point as well. But it is a Saints team that, from a team purpose and perspective, is playing spoiler, and some teams embrace that. Even if they get up for that role in this spot, Green Bay is just flat out better by a decent margin, whether they have Jaire Alexander or not. That's why I say sit 23 in this game. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the subscribe button. Appreciate all the support. I was looking through the Saints schedule and snap counts, box scores, things of that nature, trying to just get a full picture because, again, I've only seen them a couple of times this year. Have seen their most recent game when I went back and watched. I looked at their wins, and when I think of a team that's playing spoiler, I'm far more nervous if it's a team that has beaten a really like a top tier or a second tier group at nearly full strength or full strength this year. And so I went back and I looked at, hey, who have the Saints beaten this year? And again, it just gives you the thought and a fuller picture that it's not a good New Orleans team at all. So far this year, they've beaten Carolina, Carolina, they stink. They beat Dallas stinks. They beat Atlanta stinks. They beat Cleveland stinks. And they beat the Giants reek. Like, those are the wins for the Saints. Carolina, Dallas, Atlanta, Cleveland, the New York Giants. Like, if they had even one really impressive win on the resume, I'd be a little more nervous about this one. And maybe the fact, if my mind's really swirling, maybe the fact that I'm just not nervous for this game should tell me that I should be a little bit nervous. But again, it's just, I don't see it. Unless something crazy happens, I don't see it for the Saints in this game on Monday night. Last year's game was electric. New Orleans came to Green Bay, faced off the Packers. It was a week 2 or week 3. It was Jordan Love's first start at Lambeau Field. The Packers were down 17-0 with less than 12 minutes to go. Came back and won 18-17. New Orleans missed a field goal late. I forget, it was like 46, 47 yards. New Orleans missed a field goal late. Packers win 18-17 after trailing 17-0 with less than 12 minutes to go. That was an incredible win. That was an awesome game. Let's not do it again. This isn't the same Saints team, clearly, as last year, or at least early last year's version. Take care of business on Monday night. It's as simple as that. Win the coin toss again. Every team seems to defer. Last week, Green Bay won the coin toss against Seattle, said, no, just give us the ball. They handed it to Josh Jacobs a million times on the opening drive, and it resulted in a touchdown. I say win the toss against the Saints. Say, hey, we'll take the ball. Or if you lose the toss, hope that they defer and do the same damn thing you just did against Seattle. And New Orleans is far inferior to the Seahawks. Cut off the oxygen early. Don't give them hope. Don't let this be a coin toss game entering the fourth quarter if you're Green Bay. That's what I'm hoping and expecting from the Packers on Monday night. Get the ball first. Set a tone. Do not coast. Keep your foot on the gas. This should be, if the Packers do their job, this should be I don't want to say stress-free, but I don't want to say comfortable. It's just not the nature of the beast in the NFL. This isn't Oregon against, Montana State or something like that. It's not FBS, FCS matchup. Like, New Orleans is an NFL team with NFL players. But everything is pointing in favor of the Packers in this one. Cut off their oxygen early. Get a decisive win. Let the fans kick up their feet in the fourth quarter, knowing that it's more than locked up at that stage. That's what I'm hoping for from the Packers on Monday night. And I think it's possible. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Always appreciate all the support. We'll see you next time.